Welcome, all of you, to our panel on Harvard Law School and governing at our HLS 200 celebration. I'm Professor Kenneth Mack, Lawrence D. Beale Professor of Law here at Harvard Law School. We have a distinguished panel that needs very little introduction to this audience, so we're going to keep the introductions fairly short. This is a panel that we might say is inspired by the words of our prestigious Harvard Law School alum, Louis Brandeis, class of 1877, who famously said that a state was like a laboratory of democracy where people could experiment, basic citizenship rights could be protected, particularly at times when such innovation and protection of basic rights were under siege, or let's say under siege, or perhaps questioned at the national level. We have three panelists who are quite adept at conversing with you on that set of questions. We're going to go in the order listed in the program. I'm going to introduce them in that order, and they can answer questions in any order that they choose. In the center, we have Governor Michael Dukakis, class of 1960, who was a distinguished career in public service, as have all of our panelists, served in the Massachusetts House of Representatives from 1963 to 71, was the three-term governor of Massachusetts, and the 1988 Democratic nominee for President of the United States. Since that time, he's been a distinguished professor of political science at Northeastern University, and along with former U.S. Senator Paul Simon, he authored the book called How to Get into Politics and Why. And he may have some thoughts to offer on that question today. To my immediate right, Jennifer Granholm, class of 1987. Two-term governor of Michigan, led Michigan through a period of unprecedented change. You may recall something called the financial crisis, the collapse of the automobile industry. This was the person who led the state through that crisis and out again.
And is still alive to tell about it.
She also has a distinguished career in public service. She's been the assistant U.S. attorney in the Eastern District of Michigan. When she was here at Harvard Law School, she was the editor-in-chief of the Harvard Civil Rights, Civil Liberties Law Review. She clerked for Judge Damon Keith on the Sixth Circuit. She also served as Wayne County Corporation Counsel and served as Attorney General of the state of Michigan. She is a fellow, I believe, at the Institute of Politics of the University of Chicago last semester, and also is on the faculty of the University of California at Berkeley. In addition to all that, she once hosted a television show called The War Room.
That often.
where she asked questions like, what's working? And implicitly, what's not? And the state of our states, two topics on which she might have a lot to say today. To my far right is also a person who needs very little introduction to this audience, Governor Bill Weld, class of 1970. Governor Weld has served many stints in public service, assistant U.S. attorney in charge of the, he was assistant attorney general in charge of the criminal division in the Department of Justice. He's been the U.S. attorney for Massachusetts. Earlier in his career, he was a staff member in the U.S. House of Representatives, and he participated in the Watergate impeachment inquiry, as well as in the U.S. Senate. Many of you know him as the former governor of Massachusetts. I remember the election of 1990 quite well. It was a quite momentous and memorable election. So we'll leave it at that. He was also most recently the vice presidential candidate for the Libertarian Party in 2016. And he is currently a member and the principal of the firm of Mintz-Levin here in Boston. So we have three distinguished panelists. This is going to be a conversation between, I think, all of us. So what I'm going to do is just really ask the three of them a couple of quite open-ended questions. And then I'm going to open it up to you, because I'm sure that all of you have questions that you want to ask them. It's a quite fruitful and challenging time for governing. It's a quite interesting time for governing on the state level. I'm sure you all have a lot to ask about that and a lot to converse with our panelists on that subject. So I'm going to start with some just kind of very open-ended and not unexpected questions for the panelists. I'm going to just start with Harvard Law School in their particular eras. We have three panelists representing who attended Harvard Law School in quite different eras of its history, but all three of whom found their way actually quite quickly into public service and governing. And I just want to ask each of them to talk a little bit about the Harvard Law School of their era. What was it like? Did it have anything to do with preparing you for a career in governing or public service? Yes or no? How or how not? And what was the path that led you from Harvard Law School into public service? Okay, yeah, I am a law professor, so I will call on somebody. I'll ask Governor Dukakis to lead us off.
First, let me say it's great to be back and to be with two very good friends. This good woman graduated from this place and showed up at the Dukakis headquarters in Michigan and said, I want to go to work. And Bill and I have known each other since he was a young associate in the firm of Hill and Barlow, and I was responsible for young associates. Even then,
you were responsible for me, Governor.
I was responsible for him. And we've been good pals ever since. And by the way, are now working together on a number of important issues and challenges here in Massachusetts and having a great time doing it. So maybe we're at least one example in this country of Democrats and Republicans that go to work together and get things done. And I think, frankly, there's a lot more of that going on at the state and local level than people think. It's not this gong show in Washington every day. And, I mean that. And I, you know, obviously am troubled by the country's current political leadership, but I think we'll get through it in part because you have some rather strong and capable folks at the state and local level on both sides, and dramatically improved folks working for them. You know, it's been a long time since I left this place. We had Lit Tower at that time over there, but you didn't have the Kennedy School, nor did you have the Luskin School of Public Affairs, where I escaped during January, February, and March from New England winters and teach at UCLA, and schools like that all over the country. Michigan has them, I mean, lots of universities. And we're producing some really terrific young people, folks, who want to go into public service. And that's making a great difference, in my judgment, in how state and local governments are performing. Ken, how did the law school influence me? Less, I think, by what happened in the classroom, because this is not a place that is designed to prepare you for a career in public service. It's designed to prepare you for a career in the law. Part of it was the faculty. A guy like Abe Shays, who subsequently became the legal advisor of the State Department, I was in the Shays Club. Some classmates, some of whom I knew, some of whom I didn't. Paul Sarbanes and I were very close. I mean, there were only 3 Greek Americans in the whole class, and Sarbanes and Dukakis and Bronis became very close very quickly. But Bill Ruckelshaus was a classmate of mine. Antonin Scalia was a classmate of mine. But because we were assigned to sections, and you never saw anybody except the folks in the sections for the first 2 years, I didn't even know that Scalia was a classmate of mine until we took Henry Hart's Federal Courts, Federal Jurisdiction course. And I hate to tell this story, but I can't not. It was our last semester spring was coming. We were all anxious to get out and do whatever we were going to do. And from the get-go in this class, there was this guy who insisted on engaging Professor Hart in these long dialogues in which he was expressing great concern about this growing tendency at the time of federal courts to take Southern criminal cases, usually with a black defendant, out of those state courts and give the poor guy a chance to get his day in court before he was either convicted or lynched. That's back when America was great, in case those of you. And this went on for about 3 weeks. And I finally turned to the guy next to me and I said, "Who the hell is that guy?" He said, "He's Scalia. He's on the Law Review." And I've never forgotten this. I said, "Does he know what it's like to be black in the South?" Of course, I could have said black anywhere. That was my one. But the law school had a profound effect on me in terms of interest in public service and my growing desire to get deeply and actively involved. For one thing, the association I had with some of the faculty members, Abe was one of them, there were others, was very important. I was very much involved in the law school Democrats and helped to create an intern program where law school students would work, students of law school would be assigned to members of the Massachusetts legislature. And I happened to be assigned to a wonderful guy named Alexander Cella, who was from Bedford, Italian-American, graduate of Harvard. And Al was attempting to somehow get the legislature to either pardon or exonerate Sacco and Vanzetti. And that's when I first got interested in the Sacco and Vanzetti case. And I'm proud to say that 50 years later, I was governor. Couldn't pardon him posthumously, but I did issue a proclamation saying that a terrible injustice had been done, which was the case. And it's clear that neither one of these guys could possibly have committed that crime. Vanzetti was peddling fish in, where was it? Plymouth at the time. And Sacco was in Dedham. And, but the thing continues. I got an email from somebody a year ago excoriating me for doing what I did.
Really? Wow.
So I sent him back an email, and I said, I don't know how familiar you are with the geography of metropolitan Boston, but Vanzetti was at Plymouth. At the time, the crime was committed in Braintree, and Sacco was in Dedham. I said, you can't be in Plymouth or Dedham and be in Braintree at the same time. I never got a response. In any event, so I got pretty actively involved in local politics and ran for an elected town meeting in the town of Brookline while I was a student here. You know, printed up a few cards, went out and knocked on every door in the precinct, stood in front of the polling place for 13 hours and got elected. And then in 1960, my last year here, I was pretty actively involved in essentially a kind of revolution, even within the Democratic Party in Brookline, which was 5-to-1 Republican when I was a kid, but was beginning to change, and the local party organization was kind of sleepy, and a bunch of us young folks decided it was time to. Can you hear me? Sorry. Anyway, so I kind of was the ringleader in this effort to essentially overthrow the existing Democratic organization, and we were successful. So I became the Democratic Party chairman of the town of Brookline, and that was the year that Jack Kennedy was nominated and was elected. And so my friend Brontis and I, having taken the bar exam, got into his Carmen Ghia and drove to the West Coast and were involved, not actively, but certainly were there at the time. The one thing I think I would say, and I'll wrap it up at this point, that the law school did for me, did a lot of things, but was to sharpen my, how do I put this? I've always been an optimist, but I've been a questioner. And if there's one thing I came out of here with, it was a willingness to challenge conventional wisdom. I think that more than anything else is what the law school did for me. And for that, I'm very grateful. Jennifer.
Governor Granholm, Harvard Law School and Governor.
Yeah, first let me just say that it is totally an honor to be up here with you all, and it sort of puts everything for me in perspective about how special this place is, right, and where we all sit in history and our roles in it. So it is a bit mind-blowing for me. When I came here, I was like many of you probably, I was the first person in my family to even go to college, and I, was a public school kid all the way through, and so getting here was like, it was just an amazing thing, because I come from a family of immigrants. I came from Canada. It doesn't really count, but the point being that my family, when I got into Harvard, they thought, come on, show me the letter. Are you serious? Us, us. It was us. It was the family that had this great, proud thing, right? So coming here, and I was always such a goody two-shoes. And, coming here, I wanted to be a civil rights lawyer. I wanted to be a champion for the underdog. And when I got here, the only office I had ever run for before getting here, was being the editor-in-chief of the Civil Rights, Civil Liberties Law Review. And I wanted to have that, and I took extra classes in advanced con law and all of that in my second and third year. But I was here 84 to 87. And that was the time that Harvard was contemplating or was being protested against for its investments in South Africa, in the companies that do business in South Africa. Anybody here during that time? Was anybody else here in the 80s? So right? It was a big deal. So this school gave me the power and the courage to not have to be just a goody two-shoes. So I was one of the hundreds of students that were in Harvard Square in front of Derek Bach's office. Derek Bach, get the word. This is not Johannesburg. We took over the Harvard Corporation. We spent the night in the yard. We really tried to do that. In fact, I don't know if he's here, but one of my cohorts during this time was now Congressman Jamie Raskin, and Michael Anderson and Lois Murphy, who's a judge in Pennsylvania. And when there was a South African official that was coming onto campus to speak during that time, we laid down in front of the car. Now, see, if my parents had known this, oh my God. But we got hauled in front of the ad board. And Professor Charlie Nesson, criminal law professor, came and defended us before the ad board. So all we got was like a disciplinary note in our file. And I say all of that to say what this school gave to me was the freedom to have some steel in my spine, to not be afraid of conflict. Because I'm very much a harmony person. But it gave me the ability to be fierce. And I say this as a woman. Of course, having this credential is so important. It's important for all of us, but for a woman or for people of color, it is such a foundation that allows you to get in the door and have not people question what's in between your ears. And that is a huge gift. But I have to say a word about the personal side, too. Obviously, the education you get here and being able to respond to brilliant professors on the spot, all of that, very important, giving you confidence. But I would never have been governor if I hadn't come to Harvard Law School for this reason as well, is that I met my husband when I was here, and he is from Michigan. I'm not from Michigan originally. So I married Michigan. And my husband, when I came here, I had no thought of running for office. That was just, I wanted to be this champion in the civil rights area. My husband wanted to run for office. In fact, he wanted to go back to Michigan. And when he was growing up, he either wanted to be Pope or president. He went to Yale. He majored in theology. We met, so he didn't become a priest. But But when we were here, we got engaged while we were here. And we did our marriage prep at the Catholic Church. Father Tim Shannon did our marriage prep, and he was asking us in the marriage prep, he said to us, so Dan, you want to go back and you're going to move back to Michigan, and you're both interested in politics. What if the party comes to Jennifer and asks her to run for Senate or something? And Dan, who's this great feminist, he said, well, of course I would support her 1,000%. And I was like, psst, that is never going to happen. And lo and behold. And it all links to you. Because when I say the party came to me, if I hadn't worked on the Dukakis campaign in 1988, I would never have met the head of the Democratic Party in Michigan. And when he came to me, his name is Rick Weiner. I don't know if you ever connected with him directly, but he was a great soul, huge champion of yours. It's where I met him. When he came to me and said, you've got to run for Attorney General, I'm like, are you kidding me? Because at that point I had young kids, you know, ages 3, 4, and 10 months. And I was like, no way. And I'm like, pushed him off. And I go home to Dan. And I said, you cannot believe what Rick just called and said. He said, you should run for Attorney General. And Dan's like, of course you should run for Attorney General. I got the kids. This is going to be great. So Dan Mulhern did not become Pope or president, but he did become a saint for marrying me. So I owe my whole life to Harvard Law School.
Governor Weld.
Well, it's a pleasure to be back here. I lived in Cambridge for a long time after graduating, and these are familiar and revered haunts for me. You're about to learn more about William F. Weld than you want to. So I'll give you a little bit of bio here. I went to college at Harvard College undergrad, graduated in the class of 1966, which at my 25th reunion I said, gals, fellas, our class was the last class of the 1950s. And I can kind of prove that. I went through 4 years at Harvard College doing absolutely nothing but studying, majoring in Latin and Greek, and never met or heard of anyone who smoked marijuana. So I went off to Oxford with a bunch of other folks, each of whom was certain that he, and they were all he's, were going to be president of the United States. I had taken a course my sophomore year from Arthur Sutherland, who was a Harvard law professor, whom I got to be great friends with, called Constitutionalism in America. And in that course, I fell under the spell of Holmes, Oliver Wendell Holmes, Jr., and you know, came to think as he did. And Holmes famously said, I look at the law as a bad man does. I want to know where the lines and the limits are. So I said, boy, ain't that the fact, because we want rules and we want limits and we want to know what's up, and that's what distinguishes us and makes us great. And I'm a positivist in the tradition of Holmes and Ames and Austin, and I thought that was just great. And I go off to Oxford. I'm in University College, Oxford. My tutors were HLA Hart, who was waging a transatlantic war in the jurisprudence area with Lon Fuller of Harvard Law School, HLA Hart being the positivist, Lon Fuller being the Lon Fuller view of the law, which is much more purposive than positivist. And I had Gilbert Ryle from Magdalen College and Peter Strawson, also from University College. The best philosophers in all of Britain. Among the courses I went to were G.E.M. Anscombe, who was the #1 student of Wittgenstein, if you please, and she was still teaching at Oxford. And my head was really turned, and I thought, this is just great. Now I'm even more of a positivist than I was before. So then I come back to Harvard Law School. I was not a goody two-shoes at Harvard Law School. I mentioned that I did nothing at college except study. Well, all the folks at Oxford, most of whom were Rhodes Scholars, one of whom was Bill Clinton, who did become President of the United States. He was in the same college I was the year after. But they all came back to Yale Law School because they wanted to know about law as an instrument of social policy. They didn't want a bunch of dumb professors telling them what the law is. They didn't care what the law was. And I, on the other hand, had a different calculus. Remembering my undergraduate days, I said, New Haven, Cambridge. So I alone came back to Harvard Law School instead of the New Haven Law School, which many people refer to as the Yale Law School. So the big impact on me occurred while I was at Harvard Law School, and as Mike said, it wasn't in the classroom. It did have something to do with the faculty. But I took as many courses as I could on cross-registration to Harvard College or elsewhere, and I wasn't really all that interested in preparing for a Wall Street career. I can remember Paul Freund, who became a great friend while I was at law school, Sunday lunch virtually every weekend, at the Ritz in Boston. And he said, well, Mr. Weld, I've been appointed your advisor. I see you haven't taken any securities courses or economic regulation. Perhaps something more in that area would be a good idea. I said, oh, don't worry about me, Mr. Freund. I'm never going to be a practicing lawyer. 40 years later, that turned out to be very much not true. But I did take at Harvard College on cross-registration Bob Nozick's course, The Philosophy of Liberty. Nozick had to be still in his 20s, became one of the great philosophers of the world, and the budding libertarian in me began to define itself. And I read very widely outside of the curriculum. I read Leibniz, Spinoza, mostly in the jurisprudence and philosophy area. Came across Friedrich Hayek, who wrote The Road to Serfdom and the Constitution of Liberty, which I must say I was quite taken by, and that further impelled me in the libertarian direction. And I remembered my teaching from HLA Hart, and I was still a positivist. And then I took this course from Henry Hart and Art Sachs. Art Sachs went on to become a great dean of Harvard Law School, called The Legal Process. And we read the case of the Spelunkian explorers, and it was almost a course in jurisprudence. And I began to think, maybe Lon Fuller isn't such an idiot. And that watered down my feeling a little bit. And then I think in my third year, I took jurisprudence from Lon Fuller himself. He was then quite an old man, and he stood up there and scratched his head and said, I don't know, all my life I've been in love with the notion of purpose. I said, something to that. And by the time I graduated, I'd become a thoroughgoing adherent to the Lon Fuller view of the world as opposed to the HLA Hart view of the world. And I gave the English part at Harvard Commencement in Tercentenary Theater as a graduating third-year student from Harvard Law School. And it was about a question posed in David Hume's Treatise of Human Understanding, which is an epistemological treatise. In Book 3, Hume says, well, I go along and I hear someone says, this is, that is, this is, that is. And then suddenly they say, therefore, such and such ought to be done. And that's impossible, says Hume. You cannot derive an ought from an is. And I argued in that commencement address, that Hume was wrong, and that of course you can if you get together and agree on what you want to have happen, and then settle all that down and then say, well, how are we going to get there? And you take it bit by bit, that you can logically derive an ought from an is. And I began with the example of people saying, I just can't talk to the younger generation anymore. Well, that's someone who's not trying. I always thought, I was very close to Bill and Hillary Clinton around the time that Mrs. Clinton was in charge of the effort on health care. And I thought she had it just right. That we want to cover as many people as possible. We want to have costs as low as possible. We want to have the quality of care as good as possible. And there was this big debate about the individual mandate. Can we mandate that people get coverage? Well, of course we can mandate that people get coverage if we want to have the maximum number of people covered, because otherwise the 28-year-old bartender who's making $75,000 a year and thinks he's immortal is never going to get any insurance for whatsoever until he breaks his leg at Sugarloaf and runs screaming to the ER. So that's an example of deriving an ought from an is. But that was by the end of my third year at Harvard Law School, and all that happened while I was here. Thank you.
Wow.
Harvard Law School is an interesting place. Let me start with a second. Sorry, let me continue with a second question. I'm going to ask each of the three of them a little bit about their time as governors, and ask them to talk about something, could be anything, that related to their time at law school or to their legal training. And it could be related in a positive sense, in a negative sense, and just also along the way, just give us some texture of the kind of fun and the challenges of being a governor. So yeah, so something that some problem you encountered when you were a governor that somehow related to your time at Harvard Law School or to the law. So I want to go actually in the reverse order, if it's okay if I could ask Governor Weld to start off.
Well, I'm going to include the Justice Department as well as governor, because I really got my start in public life when Ronald Reagan improbably was elected president in 1980, and the fellow who had been my campaign manager when I ran against Frank Bellotti for Attorney General of Massachusetts and lost by a margin of 79% to 21%, which is the most lopsided margin of defeat in Massachusetts history. My campaign manager was also Ronald Reagan's campaign manager in the state. And so I stumbled into the job of U.S. Attorney. And I was 35 years old. And I didn't know, I knew how to try a case, civil case, but that's about it. I took a lot of counsel from Charlie Nesson and Charles Freed, both of whom had become very good friends. And I knew Charlie and Fern well socially, as well as Charles and his wife. And so Charlie Nesson said to me, focus on merit hiring and let nothing interfere with that. And then he said, keep your priority list short. And Charles Freed, who I forgot to mention in the previous answer, I took legal and moral responsibility from Charles Freed and Ron Dworkin, who's a philosopher from MIT. And that was the most passionating course I took at Harvard Law School, and I wrote my third-year paper for Charles Freed. And he gave me equally serious advice. So I went into the U.S. Attorney's Office, which had become, it was not a dumping ground, but I'll tell you, everybody for decades who served in that office, almost everybody, with exceptions, had come because they were recommended by the senator or the speaker. That would be Ted Kennedy or Tip O'Neill. A lot of them were not only Irish Democrats, they were unemployed Irish Democrats. So the office was good, but it was not a leader in the United States. And I began hiring off the rank list at, yes, Michigan, Harvard, New Haven, law reviews, getting very smart people to come and work in the office. And it took a little while to ramp up, and the FBI thought these, these spoiled kids really didn't know much about what goes on the street. And they were right, but the spoiled kids were very, very smart, and they learned quickly. And, I had, when I ran for Attorney General in '78, I had really one issue. I said, we need to make greater use of investigative grand juries. And we had, on paper, the Attorney General could impanel a statewide investigative grand jury. That was not popular in the Massachusetts legislature at the time for reasons I'll get to. So we began to do better as a result of that focus on hiring, and we used long lead time investigations to make cases that would not be brought if we weren't there. And that was my charge to the troops. We don't want to take what the FBI brings us. Let the DAs prosecute the bank robberies. We want to bring cases that would not occur if we weren't here. And federal law enforcement and state law enforcement are very different. State law enforcement, you know a crime has been committed. Murder, there's a body. Bank robbery, there's witnesses. Federal crimes, mail fraud, wire fraud, financial crimes, public corruption, they occur in secret. No one has an incentive to report that this crime has occurred, and you ferret it out by use of the grand jury, compelling testimony. And we made cases in the financial area, the public corruption area. We had in my 5 years as U.S. Attorney, we had 111 public corruption cases, which Mark Wolf, another Harvard Law grad who was my deputy, oversaw meticulously. And we had convictions at the trial level in 110 out of 111. And not Rudy Giuliani himself had a percentage near to that. So, okay, we were doing good work because of my concentrating on what Charlie Nesson and Charles Fried had told me to do. When I got to Washington as head of the criminal division, where I served for 2 years after the 5 years as U.S. Attorney, there was Charles Fried. He was Solicitor General of the United States, and he was at the morning meeting in the AG's office every day. And I'll make a long story short and just say that, you know, the oath I took was to, well, no, the motto of the department is to do justice without fear or favor. And I tried to emphasize that in my time there. And in Washington, there are people who don't want you to do that. Just as in Boston, people had defended against our public corruption prosecutions by saying, this is petty bribery. This is, you know, this is not a federal offense. This is a matter of essentially local concern. Dismiss this, Your Honor. These people have no business sticking their federal nose into our state business. And needless to say, that did not go down very well with the federal judges. So those motions were not successful. But Charles and I fought kind of a rearguard action in favor of acting without fear or favor. And the department under A.G. Meese, who's a very, very decent guy, personally, became more and more under the sway of movement conservatives who were not interested in doing justice without fear or favor. So Arnie Burns, who's the deputy, and myself, and each of our top 3 aides resigned in protest over that in 1988. I think that action, again, was a product of long discussions with Charles Fried and things I had absorbed at Harvard Law School.
Governor Granholm.
Well, like you, obviously, like you, Governor Weld, my experience with this law school helped to prepare me for the U.S. Attorney's Office, for the Attorney General's Office, for being Corporation Counsel. But I don't think there's anything that could have prepared me for being governor, especially during the time that I was governor. I was governor from 2002 through to the beginning of 2011. And maybe I can just share a quick story to give you what I feel about this, because I don't know that any law school could have prepared me for this. So at the beginning of my term, beginning of my first term as governor, we were just coming out of a national recession, and George Bush was president. It was beginning of 2003. All of my advisors said, what a great time to be governor, because, of course, during a recession, people don't buy cars or big products, right? But at the end of a recession, there's pent-up demand. So usually, when the nation, you know, the old saying, when the nation catches a cold, we would say Michigan catches pneumonia. But after the recession is over, we would come back more quickly because people were all of a sudden going to start to buy cars. Well, the end of 2003 happened, and the economy wasn't coming back. There wasn't all of these jobs that my advisors and the economists said would be created. And I got this call from the head of the Michigan Economic Development Corporation. And he said, Gov, we got a big problem. There is a little tiny city in the middle of Michigan called Greenville. And Greenville has 8,000 people in it. And they're about to lose a major factory. It's a refrigerator factory. Electrolux operates it. And I said, well, how many people work at the factory? And he said, almost 3,000 people of 8,000. So 3,000 people of 8,000 people in the town worked at this factory. And he said, we're going to lose it to Mexico. And I said, I'm the governor. Hell no. We're going to go to Greenville, and we will make Electrolux an offer they can't refuse. Not like a Chris Christie offer, but, you know, we were going to offer them tax incentives and stuff like that. So I bring my whole cabinet to Greenville, and we sat, and Greenville City Hall is like the size of, you know, maybe 4 of these squares on the ceiling. I mean, it's a small place, and we sat in this big square table, and the mayor was there, and the head of the city council was there, and the head of the UAW, who represented the workforce, was there, and the head of the community college was there, and we basically emptied our pockets of chips and, you know, made a pile and slid it across the table to the management of Electrolux. And in this pile of chips were things like 0 taxes for 20 years, and we would help to build them a new factory, and the workers were going to give so much in concessions, they didn't want anyone to know how much they were willing to sacrifice to keep these jobs in this little town. And the management of Electrolux took our list of incentives, and they went outside the room for 17 minutes. And they came back in and they said, wow, this is the most generous that any community has ever been to try to keep jobs. But there's nothing you can do to compensate for the fact that we can pay $1.57 an hour in Juarez, Mexico. And so we're going. When he said to me, there's nothing you can do, Governor, I felt like a major failure. And on the month that the last refrigerator came off the assembly line at Electrolux in Greenville, Michigan, the employees there all had this big gathering at Clackle's Orchard Pavilion. It was called, this gathering, the Last Supper. And it was like a community mourning. And I went to this event, even though I was not invited. And I go in, and there was 1,000 people in there. There were people eating off of 8 top tables out of box lunches. There was a sad band playing, or a band playing sad music. It was probably a sad band as well. And I go up to the first table, and this guy, you know, he's got tattoos, he's got his baseball cap on backwards, and he says, Governor! He says, he stands up right away, and he says, I want you to meet my daughters. He has his 2 teenage daughters there, and he pulls them over, and he says, I have worked at this factory for 30 years. I'm 48 years old. I went from high school to factory. My father worked at this factory. My grandfather worked at this factory. All I know, he said, is how to make refrigerators. He puts his hand on his chest like this, and he says, so, Governor, tell me, who is ever going to hire me? Who's ever going to hire me? And that question was asked by everyone in Clackle's Orchard Pavilion that day, and by everyone in one of the thousands of communities that have lost factories like this since the turn of this century. No law school education can prepare you for that. That was year 1 of my term, and the global shift in manufacturing jobs continued. And toward the end, when you referenced the financial crisis, between December of 2008 and June of 2009, as governor, I got over 1,000 WARN Act notices. That is, for those of you who do labor law, you know, it is the warning that an employer must file with the governor and the local unit of government if they are about to engage in a mass layoff, which is defined as 50 people or more. Got over 1,000 of them. We had the highest unemployment rate in the nation. It was nothing, no law school could prepare you for that. But what this place did give me was people who I met here, who are still our dearest friends, who were our touchstones during this really hard period of time, who would always remind you of who you are, the friends that you make here. We go on vacation with them every single year, and they, I feel like, held me together just as we do the same for them in their particular crises. And the final thing I will say is that when I was here, I took a class at the K School called Leadership with Ronnie Heifetz, who was teaching it at the time. And in that class, he said, never forget that you cannot answer a tuba with a piccolo. You must answer a tuba with a tuba. It was a lesson about strength and about being fierce in the face of massive blowback. That lesson is one I took with me every one of those 8 years.
I certainly can't top that.
Yes, you can. Oh, come on.
How many of you were here in the 50s? Any of us? Not many.
Couple guys.
A few. When I entered the Massachusetts legislature in 1962, this state was one of the 3 or 4 most corrupt in the country.
Mike, you got to lean in
Sorry.
a little bit more.
When I entered the Massachusetts legislature in 1962, this state was one of the 3 or 4 most corrupt in the country. We had a state crime commission that Governor Volpe had organized that was indicting people every week. So the first priority for those of us who were coming into the legislature, a bunch of younger folks, was to do something about this. And I think one of the things this place did for me, and I can't describe it in any detail, was to send me out of here with a very strong sense that public integrity had to be a priority if I was going to be in public life. And it isn't that Massachusetts or any other state is going to be corruption-free, but I think I can say to you, and Bill played a role in this, a lot of us did, that this state today does have a reputation for integrity and for competence. And I think those two things, in a kind of intangible way, were things that I gained here. And the decade of the 60s was a decade at the State House when we systematically attempted to clean the place up. Now, anyone will tell you, and these two good folks will say the same thing that I'm about to say to you, is that if you're governor, obviously, the quality and caliber of the people you pick and the tone you're trying to set are absolutely critical, not only in terms of what you do and how you do it, but the sense you want to convey to the public that this is on the level, and the people that are working in government care deeply and set high standards of integrity for themselves and the people that work for them. And I'm not sure I can explain it, but I do think that's one of the things I came out of here with. Some of it had to do with associations with faculty members, with classmates who themselves went into public life. And it was very important. Did I run a corruption-free administration? Not quite. I was elected, I was defeated, I came back and defeated the guy that defeated me, and then I was reelected for a third time after that. In my second term, sadder but a little wiser when it came to not only running the place and being a good governor, but being a much better consensus builder than I was the first time around. And one of the lessons I learned, I'm not sure the law school gave you this, because remember, we're taught in the context of an adversarial legal system. But certainly that defeat made me a much better listener. I was a pretty good talker when I got to the State House. I wasn't a very good listener. I was the second time around. Discovered that, for one thing, listening is a lot less tiring than talking. And secondly, you learn things. So those consensus-building skills were important, and I was determined the second time around to do it better. We didn't have a Secretary of Education at that time in the cabinet system in Massachusetts. That came later. So I decided to appoint a special assistant for education who would be my point person in education. And I was very impressed with a guy who had worked for me during the campaign, but had come to me highly recommended by others. Born in the North End, grew up in Hyde Park, went to Bridgewater State College, PhD from the University of Connecticut in education. You know, my kind of guy. He was a principal in Brockton, Massachusetts, and then a division chief in the State Department of Education and undergraduate dean at Worcester State College. So I made him my special assistant. And we were out there working our heads off trying to put together some major educational reform legislation. And about 8 months into that administration, my dear wife came to me one day and she said, this guy in Delicato, she said, he's a pathological liar. I said, what are you talking about? I mean, the guy's doing great work, working closely with the legislature. We're really putting together some really significant legislation. She said, I'm sorry. Kitty said to me, I'm telling you, Michael, he's a pathological liar. I blew her off. He was a pathological liar. And he was the only person that worked for me in 12 years that was convicted and effectively of corruption, and boy, was I embarrassed. I teach this now to my students, and the obvious, the obvious lesson to be learned is pay attention to your spouse or your partner or whoever it is that you're living with, because sometimes they catch things that you miss. And I'm not sure that's a lesson I learned here at the law school, but it's an important lesson. But I do think this a strong commitment to integrity and to picking the very best people you can is something I got a lot of from this place. And I think all three of us will tell you that that kind of commitment is critical. And it's very important that you understand it. And I'd like to think that, you know, we made our mistakes, everybody does, but I don't think, with that one exception, we made the mistake of not looking for competence and integrity. And look, when it comes to government, folks, 90% of it is people. 90% of it is people, the quality and caliber of the folks that you pick, and then what you try to do to kind of motivate them to do great things. And a lot of that came from here.
Thank you. All right, so I'm going to ask one last question to the panel, and we're going to open up to conversation with all of you. You know, we've been kind of looking backwards. I want to look forwards and sort of taking Governor Dukakis' book, How to Get into Politics and Why. Like, let's sort of talk about today. Somebody wants to go into politics, particularly at the state level, lots of challenges. Among them, the decline of the mainstream media, the erosion of the grounds for agreement on truth and for compromise in politics, the role of money in politics, the sharpening of cultural and economic divisions among the electorate, challenges of globalization, we've already heard about, and citizens' deep suspicion and cynicism about the role of government. We could go on. But I don't know, if a young person, let's say a law student or a young lawyer, came up to you today, what advice would you give about the challenges of governing in today's environment? And I would start with Governor Granholm.
Well, I'm sure we all get asked this question by young people a lot. What advice do you have for me? And the thing I tell young people, and I hope that there are those of you out here who are contemplating serving in some way. One, it is not about you. You've got this great pedigree, we know. They want you to act for them. And if you don't have, this is really important, if you have not yourself been through some struggle, I hope you will put yourself in a position to see other people's pain so that you can be authentic when you are proposing to change things. So when I was Attorney General, I poached a program from the Attorney General of Mississippi. It was called 2000 for 2000. I was elected as Attorney General in 1998. And the idea was to recruit 2,000 adults to team up with 2,000 kids who were chronically truant in elementary school as early indicators that they might end up in the criminal justice system. It was a crime prevention strategy, right? And if I'm going to recruit 2,000 people, of course, I have to walk the talk as well. And so I teamed up, the mentoring agency that we were working with paired me with an 8-year-old girl from Detroit named Brittany. And when I first went to see Brittany, she lived in the upper flat of a boarded-up house in Detroit. And she was chronically truant because her mother was a heroin addict and could not get her to school. And when I went to her place, she had a pink sweatshirt on. I will never forget it. She had holes in the sleeves. She had only one sock, and she had a sheet of paper in her hands. And the sheet of paper was from the mentoring agency. And it was a list of 50 things that you could do with a mentor. Go to the ballpark, go read a book, go to the library. Brittany had checked off every single one of the 50 things because she just wanted someone to see her. And over the course of our mentoring relationship, I started when she was 8, she is now 27, and I'm still mentoring her. We were a team. She came on vacations with us. Her mother died of a drug overdose. She was put into the foster care system in Michigan. And seeing what she went through in that foster care system was such an eye-opener for me. It was so messed up. It was one of the reasons why I had to run for governor, not because of me, but because of her and kids like her. Brittany was adopted by her half-sister in Georgia and is now in the criminal justice system in Georgia as a sheriff's assistant. She's a single mom, and her son has sickle cell anemia. He's 5 years old. She earns minimum wage. She lives in a trailer. Every single day for her, every time she has, I lease her a car, but every single day, if there is a flat tire, if she needs an oil change, everything is a crisis to somebody in deep poverty. I see this every day, and I say this about me, but I want people who are considering running for office to completely understand and get the pain that's out there among real people. So for you, Harvard Law School graduates or students, you are in this incredibly privileged spot. This place is giving you such an incredible education. You have this credential that you will carry with you. And now, you've got to use it. You've got to be beyond self. You have to use it. You have a duty. You have a duty to the world in some way, shape, or form to go beyond self. I'm going to close with this. Nancy Pelosi describes having met or having gone to South Africa and having met with a bishop. And on the bishop's office wall was this prayer. It said, "When at last I stand before the face of God, God will say to me, 'Show me your wounds.' And if I have no wounds, God will ask, 'Was there nothing worth fighting for?' In the end, you Harvard Law School privileged people, I hope we all bear the scars and the wounds from battles worth fighting for on behalf of other people."
Governor Weld.
Well, I'm glad you quoted Brandeis. Our motto when I came into office in 1991 was that the states can be laboratories of democracy. Our Bible was a book called Laboratories of Democracy by David Osborne. My chief sort of strategist, first in the healthcare area, then as administration and finance secretary, was a guy named Charlie Baker, who's now the governor. And we would sit around and just think of how we could do things a little bit differently. And in some cases, what we did became models for federal legislation, which is the idea behind the states being laboratories of democracy. In my third or fourth year, we enacted a reform of our welfare system where we put in a requirement that anybody receiving welfare, if they did not have school-age young kids that they had to take care of and they were able-bodied, they had to have a job, work 20 hours a week. And it didn't matter if they said they couldn't find work. We had plenty of work. You know, we had schools, hospitals, prisons needed people to do real work, not just leaf raking, although it might include that. And there were screams of outrage. And I remember one man coming up to me at a public meeting and say, "You are just the biggest racist in Massachusetts." I said, "Oh, really?" And he said, "Yeah, this is unfair to black people." I said, "Oh, really?" Never mind that the welfare caseload is overwhelmingly white. You know, blacks are less well represented than their percentage of the population would. But I said, "Well, your inarticulate minor premise, sir, is that black people don't like to work, and I'm the racist?" So anyway. The next year, the welfare caseload dropped by over 50%, and so that caught people's attention. And that saves a lot of public money, by the way, that can go into social programs, and did. And Baker has always been a hero in the nonprofit community because of the amount of money he was able to get to put into social welfare programs, and that led to the 1996. Welfare reform that was enacted in Washington. Another thing we did, again, in my first term, you got to strike while the iron is hot if you get into public office with some authority, was education reform. The level of funding in various school districts in Massachusetts was very disparate. Wellesley spent, I don't know, $25,000 per kid, and there were districts that couldn't afford more than $6,000 a kid. And I thought that was wildly not a good idea. And I saw cases bubbling up in the court systems of various states. In New Jersey, the state Supreme Court said, no, you can't do this. This is unconstitutional. And I said I didn't want to admit to everybody that I was a softie. But I just said to my staff, look, maybe we should do this before some court tells us to do it, and maybe we can bargain for some stuff. Because the idea of putting a lot more money into education, which we did, was wildly popular in the legislature. So I went to the legislature and said, look, I'm willing to put a lot more money into education. I would like some management givebacks, so to speak. I'd like to have some high-stakes tests in 4th, 8th, and 10th grade, and you got to pass them as a condition of going on. Because my perception had been that there was a tradition of social promotion that had grown up that was graduating students who, when they got to even community college, couldn't pass the qualifications in reading or math. So they had to take remedial math and English when they got to college, and that wasn't doing anybody any favors. Again, there were screams that this was very unfair, and people tried to undo the accountability part of the equation after I left office, but Governor Cellucci fought them off. And that combination of more funding and then stricter accountability led to Massachusetts being ranked #1 after a phase-in period of 3, 4, 5 years, being ranked #1 in both reading and mathematics of all 50 states 7 years in a row. So, you know, actions have consequences. When I was U.S. Attorney, I started prosecuting people for phony disability claims. They'd have a fight with the mayor. They'd go out and say, oh, I slipped and fell and hurt my back. Complete phony story. We would prove it. And, you know, they received their checks every month in the mail. So we prosecuted that as mail fraud. And we convicted the top 3 people in the mayor's budget office. And the next year, the number of disability claims went down by 89%. So people do pay attention. And those were just experiments, and that's apropos of the laboratories. Recently, I spoke at the swearing-in of a justice on the state Supreme Judicial Court, where I had clerked, and I said, I hope, Justice Lowy, that you will bear in mind that you know, often the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court has sailed a little bit ahead of the federal government in terms of finding rights of citizens, and that might come in handy just in case the rights of citizens should come under attack in Washington, D.C., just to pick a location out of the blue. And I really meant it. You know, I spent one of my stints in Washington was on the Nixon impeachment. I shared an office with a young woman named Hillary Rodham, and we wrote the book on what's grounds for impeachment of a president. So if I can digress a tiny bit, in 1999, I got a call from John Podesta, who was then President Clinton's chief of staff. He said, looks like they're going to proceed against my guy, meaning in the impeachment. And, you know, we need someone to testify as an expert witness on the law of impeachment. We've looked around. There are 2 people that really know a lot about this. The other one is most definitely disqualified by interest. So I testified as an expert witness for the defense on the law of impeachment. I thought my old friend Lamar Smith from Texas was going to leap across the table and strangle me, he being a Republican. But I was happy to do it. So I do know a lot about that, and there's a lot of loose talk these days about what's grounds for that, and it's not what you would think. A lot of people, myself included, are violently against the view of the current president in areas of treaties and trade and that sort of thing. That's not going to get you too far when an impeachment remedy is concerned, because the president's powers are absolutely at their apogee where treaties are concerned. There was an issue in last year's campaign. I had strongly supported the Trans-Pacific Partnership. The then candidate, now president, had said, no, we can't have that because China will dominate it. He didn't understand that China was not a member. In fact, that was one of the arguments in favor of joining. But it's well within his power as president. What impeachment really is a remedy for what happens if someone's interfering with the constitutional schema. For example, the sanctuary cities issue. I'm going to deny funding to sanctuary cities. That would be a classic impeachable offense in terms of quality, character, because it's interfering with the role of Congress, appropriating and authorizing the roles of Congress, not of the executive. And last year I carried a copy of the Constitution around with me every day when I was running for vice president as a libertarian, and I recalled that the real reason why President Nixon was impeached successfully in the House, I guess he resigned before it went to a vote, but he was going to be, was it was a point first made by Hillary Rodham on the staff, that the President's oath says, I will take care that the laws be faithfully executed. That's the duty of the executive. And Mr. Nixon had said to Haldeman, unfortunately on tape, unfortunately for him, yeah, let's tell him this is national security. Tell him it's FBI. Tell him it's CIA. Tell Justice they got to close down the investigation. Well, that was not taking care that the laws be faithfully executed, and it was the article of impeachment that got the highest number of votes. And, you know, just think to yourself, you don't need a tape to prove that far worse than that has happened in Washington, where the Justice Department and the rule of law are involved. But impeachment being a political remedy, as long as the R's hold both houses, it's not likely to get too far. When President Clinton was impeached, there were R's in both houses. When President Nixon was impeached, there were D's in both houses. Anyway, in terms of the advice that I would give to young people, I have a 475-page memoir in the can, which I'm not quite happy with yet. But its title is "Come On In, the Water's Fine." And that's really my advice to young people, to go into politics, and harking back to my first answer, to govern with purpose. And your purpose, as Governor Granholm said, has to be the betterment of the lot of the people you represent. I do take a Benthamite view of that, the greatest good for the greatest number. But I would encourage anybody to, I've had the time of my life, both in the Justice Department and as governor, and you can too. Thank you.
Awesome.
So let me take off from there. I've been teaching now full-time for 27 years at Northeastern, 22 at UCLA, 1 quarter, January, February, and March. I have hundreds and hundreds of former students that are out there doing great things in the public sector, and frankly, my mission as a teacher is to encourage them to enter public life, whatever makes sense to them at any level. The notion that things are particularly bad now and weren't back then is nonsense. I was at Swarthmore from 1951 to 55 when a guy named Joseph R. McCarthy was running around the country questioning people's patriotism. I graduated from Swarthmore in 55, was drafted 6 weeks later, and with a motley group of 30 from the Fargo building headed for Fort Dix, New Jersey for my first 8 weeks of basic training. 3 days after I got there, I had what passed for a personnel interview. You know, another draftee who's a personnel specialist in interviewing you for 2 minutes and then deciding what you can do for the next 2 years, except my guy had a file on me. This is in pre-computer America, folks. With every single political activity I had engaged in my 4 years at Swarthmore College. So the interview went something like this. So I see you ran a fundraising drive for the American Civil Liberties Union while you were at Swarthmore. I said, yeah, as a matter of fact, I did. And you were the chairman of the Students for Democratic Action, which was the student wing of the ADA. I said, yeah, that's right. By the way, I was succeeded by a guy named Carl Levin in that capacity, who then met up with me a few years later here. And this guy had a file with every single political activity I'd ever engaged in. Now, at that time, some draftees were arriving at places like Dix and being held indefinitely or being discharged other than honorably because of certain organizations they had been part of before they got there. Fortunately for me, the guy decided to send me to Korea, which was okay. Where do you think they got that information? It took us 10 years to find out. The FBI, this is in the 50s, had a tap on the Swarthmore switchboard and was recording every single phone call that went through that switchboard, and apparently somebody was listening and taking notes. And if they had a file on me, and this had a file on millions, who was I? I was a street kid from Boston. I don't think I was a threat to national security. So that was a very bad time, folks. We've been through a few of these. But you know what I say to my students these days? This is a wonderful time to get involved in public service. And I mean it. And to just reinforce what both of my colleagues have said, why do you go into public service? I know of nothing more personally fulfilling and satisfying than being in a position where you can make a difference in the lives of your fellow citizens. And that's what it's all about. So I encourage my kids to get ready for public service. I do everything I can in my teaching to try to prepare them for public service. And they're out there. One of them just got elected to Congress in California. Jimmy Gomez, the youngest of 6 in a Mexican immigrant family which came here illegally in the 70s and was legalized under the Reagan amnesty bill in the 80s, something we tend to forget. Settled in Riverside, California, whose mayor, by the way, is another former student of mine, and terrific. Graduated from high school, was working at Target or someplace, and somehow took a course in the community college in Riverside and got a B. And somebody said, Jesus, Gomez, you ought to enroll. And he did. And then came as a transfer student at UCLA, where I got him in a public policy course that I teach. And there was something about this kid. There was something about this kid that really So I said, come on and talk to me. Ever been involved in politics? Got any interest? Well, I'm interested. Have you ever been involved? No. Jimmy Gomez graduated magna from UCLA. Came to the Kennedy School. I had him across the river here. Just, you know, still has a 617 cell phone number. He keeps saying, for God's sake, you got to get rid of this thing. Went back, got a master's, got an MPP from the Kennedy School, back to Los Angeles, worked for a member of Congress, worked for the unions, ran for the assembly from East LA, got elected, almost became speaker. You know, they turn over speakers about every 3 years there. And when Kamala Harris was elected to the Senate, and Javier Becerra was appointed as Attorney General, the Becerra seat was vacated. Jimmy just won that seat by 20 percentage points. He's in Congress. And I could sit here all day, and I won't, obviously, we'll run out of time, and tell you about other similar success stories. So my message to my students these days is this is a great time to get into public service. And let me tell you something. In a strange way, Trump has stimulated enormous interest on the part of my students in public service. I don't know that he knows that. Somebody ought to tell him, maybe, I don't know. These kids really want to get involved. And they're pouring into my office, and of course I'm in a wonderful position to spend some time talking about how do you get in it. And the co-op program at Northeastern is just a natural for these kids. I mean, they can do 3 separate 6-month work assignments while they're undergraduates. And they're doing it. And once they do those co-ops and they're working at either in Washington or at the state level, wherever they want to, let me tell you, they're turned on. And it's one of the reasons why, just to repeat what I said earlier, I think the quality and caliber of the folks that are serving us at the state and local level in particular is light years better than it was when I first started in public life. And it's partly because we now have these schools which are training folks to be public servants, and partly because these kids are motivated. So I'm very optimistic about the future of public service in this country, and we'll get through this period, I hope. And you're gonna be very impressed. There are going to be a lot more Jimmy Gomez's who are going to be serving us.
Can I jump on with can I just do one quick follow-up just to sort of jump on and ratify what Governor Dukakis has just said? Emily's List, which obviously is about Democratic women, but just as an indication of the enthusiasm, at about this time in the last cycle, about 900 women had raised their hand to run for office. This cycle, same period of time, 19,000 women have raised their hand to run. So there's an enthusiasm out there.
All right, thank you all. We've got some time to extend the conversation to the audience. I'm wondering, do we have a microphone? Does someone have? Okay. Oh, good. You got mics on the desk. I don't teach in this classroom. So I think you can press a button and turn your microphone on. But questions, conversation for our panelists? Sure. Gentleman right here in the, go ahead.
First, thanks to my classmate for bringing her profoundly humane perspective on something that is all too often treated as an abstraction. And now for all of the governors, I wonder if you'd direct your perspective to the governed and advise us how we can better practice and promote civil, productive civic engagement, better citizenship, if you will, so that those who followed in your footsteps as governors have a stronger base upon which to stand.
I'd begin by requiring every single high school kid in this country to take a civics course. We don't take civics for some reason anymore. And to do an internship with a local public official. I'm serious. If every single kid in this country, while in high school, had that experience, I think you'd have a citizenry that first would be far more literate in government and politics, and secondly, would be turned on as these kids are. We had a guidance counselor at Brookline High School when I was a legislator who decided, not surprisingly, that the last half of the senior year was kind of a waste. Kids had sent in their applications, this, that, and the other thing. And so the high school at the time, I don't know if they still have it, basically said to these kids, if you want to spend half of your last semester of your senior year doing something interesting, we'll let you do that. So she called me and said, could you use a high school senior? I said, are you kidding me? At that time, Massachusetts legislators had 0 staff. I mean, 0 staff. You know, I'd sit there typing my letters. I had a series of high school kids from Brookline who worked for me during that January through June period, who were not only terrific, every single one of them went into public service professionally. Think about it. Think about it. So it's not, you know, a profound program. All I'm saying is time to get back to civics and to give these kids an opportunity to connect to the political and governmental system early. And if they do, trust me, it will have a profound effect on them. No question about it.
So I think the major cause for the troubles, the political troubles in the country is the hyper-partisanship that we see in Washington, and by and large that does not go on at the state level. The governor and the state legislators are right in front of the people they represent. You couldn't get away with that nonsense as a governor because people say, what are you doing? Because they see every day what the governor does. You know, there's 15, 17 stories a day about the governor of Massachusetts, if you count the Globe and the Herald together. So it doesn't happen at the state level, and so the benefits of working across the aisle are evident at the state level. There's 2 things that could be done at the national level that I think would help. One is term limits. What's happened now is that both national parties, Republican and Democrat, have gotten obsessed with raising money and obsessed with staying in power. And the only way they can lose, not the only way, but the easiest way for them to lose an election is to have someone outflank them from the right if they're a Republican, or on the left if they're a Democrat, which drives them to extremes, which makes it less likely that they will cooperate. Because they want to be there forever, enjoying all those perks. So if you put in term limits so that they knew they wouldn't be there forever, maybe they'd want to get something done in their 6 or 8 years in Congress. And the other thing is to focus laser-like attention on the redistricting process, which happens every 10 years. And generally it's done between the governor and the members of the state legislature, and they have an incentive to come together on a plan to protect their incumbents, because otherwise it might go to the courts, and no one wants that. So if more sunshine could be focused on that process, and perhaps if the courts were a little bit sharper in saying we don't want lizard-shaped districts, let's just, you know, give us a district that has 600,000 people in it, but looks like some recognizable parallelogram, that might be a good idea as well.
Right. Agree totally. Agree totally. And there is, of course, a redistricting effort happening. I would say now that I'm living in California and they have these jungle primaries, and it's regardless of party, the top 2 win. It requires people to be reasonable. In Michigan, it's so terribly gerrymandered that it allows for people and encourages people to be unreasonable. And so I completely agree that I think that reshaping these districts to be something rational, nonpartisan citizen commissions like they did in Arizona, something like that should be required in every state. And I think that will diminish the partisanship that you're seeing in Washington.
The other thing you want to do is look for areas of common ground. You know, if you went out and took a poll tomorrow and said to the American people, should working Americans and their families have decent, affordable health care, what do you think the numbers would look like? 93% say yes, and the other 7 haven't thought about it. Serious. Now, how you put that together, how you come together around that, but 93% of the American people think that working Americans, and 80 to 85% of the uninsured people in this country, folks, are working. They're not sitting around. They're not on welfare. If you're on welfare, you get Medicaid. These are working Americans. No health insurance. I can't believe that it should be possible for people of goodwill to do that. And another interesting development, don't want to go on at great length. The guy in the White House apparently doesn't believe in climate change. We all know climate change is happening. If I ever meet Trump, I'll tell him to go out to Glacier National Park fast, because in 10 years there won't be any glaciers there. But what's happened? Very interesting. Jerry Brown is meeting with the president of China.
Right.
You've got a broad bipartisan coalition who understand that climate change is real, and they're being supported by a guy named Bloomberg, who grew up in Medford, Massachusetts. Family couldn't buy a house in Medford, Massachusetts when Mike Bloomberg was a kid, because he was Jewish, in Medford, Massachusetts, back when America was great. Just remember that. But he now has an institute that he is funding, supporting state and local political leaders who, in effect, along with a lot of folks in the private sector, are basically saying to people like Trump and Pruitt, hey, that's yesterday. This is real. We're going to go out there. And they're doing it. They're doing it. So lots is happening out there, folks. And a lot of it is at the state and local level, but it's all a question. Bill and I are involved in a couple of really important things right now in this state. And people say, gee whiz, I mean, you and Weld. Yeah, me and Weld. One of them is Boston Harbor, which when you guys were here, many of you, was a sewer with a horse rendering plant on Spectacle Island and open sewage pits on Moon. It's now one of the great, great recreational areas. The two of us and others, obviously, had something to do with that. And we're working on something out in the western part of the state, which is very exciting and potentially really wonderful. So it's out there. And it's just a question of, I think, Ken, looking for places where we have agreement. And in my experience, I'm not being a Pollyanna here, in my experience, most of the great issues of the day are issues where good people of goodwill, can come up with viable and practical and constructive solutions.
All of which goes to show that you really can derive an ought from an is.